It was 7:30 on a Friday evening. We were standing in the VIP lounge of the university's spring academic gala. Muffled jazz music and the clinking of champagne glasses drifted through the heavy oak doors. Inside, however, the air was entirely suffocating. David, Laura, Ashley, and my academic advisor, Marlene, had me backed into a corner. David stepped forward and pushed a thick, backdated non-disclosure agreement across the mahogany table. Laura leaned in, resting a manicured hand on the document. She kept her voice dangerously low. "Sign it," she whispered. "Ashley is buried in debt. She needs this scholar title more than you do." I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or beg for fairness. I simply looked through the frosted glass wall of the lounge. Out in the main lobby, standing near a marble pillar, was my 8-year-old brother, Noah. He was wearing an oversized suit, clutching his frayed blue backpack, looking completely lost in the crowd of academics. They had brought him here as a prop, a silent hostage to ensure my compliance. I shifted my gaze back to the adults in the room. I smiled, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "Is that what Marlene told you to? If you have ever been asked to sacrifice your hard work to cover up a family member's failure, drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from. You do not have to explain. Just let me know I am not alone." Ashley stood slightly behind Laura, holding the crystal trophy that had my algorithm's name etched into its base. She could not even look me in the eye. Marlene stood with her arms crossed, wearing the sympathetic expression of a seasoned politician. They all thought they had won. They thought that 21 years of conditioning had trained me to quietly surrender my achievements to keep the peace. They assumed I would pick up the silver pen, sign away 14 months of sleepless nights, and walk back out into the cold Boston air with nothing. They did not realize that I had stopped playing their game a long time ago. I looked at the non-disclosure agreement. It was 7 pages long, meticulously drafted to strip me of all intellectual property rights to the quantitative finance model I had built from scratch. It was designed to erase my existence from my own creation. David tapped his watch, silently rushing me. Laura gave me a soft, pleading look that used to break my heart. I picked up the heavy silver pen from the table. I felt the cool metal against my fingers. I held it for exactly 3 seconds. I did not sign it. The moment I set the pen back down on the table, the atmosphere in the room completely shattered. David exhaled sharply, a sound of profound disappointment. Laura withdrew her hand from the table as if she had been burned. Marlene dropped her mask of professional sympathy. She stepped forward, planting both hands firmly on the polished wood. "Serena," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "You need to think about the bigger picture here. If you make a scene, I will personally ensure your fellowship is permanently revoked. You will not graduate, and you will certainly not find a research position anywhere in this city." I checked the grandfather clock on the wall. It was exactly 7:34. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my small notebook, quietly logging the time and the threat. Marlene's eyes narrowed. David stepped closer, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me. "You are being entirely unreasonable," he said. "We are family. Your sister is drowning, and you are acting like a cold-blooded calculator. You have always been the difficult one, Serena." I did not argue. Arguing is what a victim does when they want to be understood. I had zero interest in being understood by people who were actively trying to rob me. I looked at Ashley. She was clutching the Crystal Award so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked terrified, not of me, but of the possibility that her manufactured reality was about to crack. I felt nothing but a profound, clinical detachment. They had spent my entire life assigning me the role of the quiet worker, the invisible pillar that held up their shiny facade. "You can keep the trophy tonight, Ashley," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I hope it feels heavy." I did not wait for her response. I turned my back on my parents, ignored Marlene's glaring eyes, and walked toward the exit. Laura called my name, a sharp, panicked sound, but I did not stop. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the bright lights of the gala. I walked straight toward Noah. He looked up at me, his wide eyes searching my face for reassurance. I knelt down, adjusted the collar of his oversized jacket, and gave him a gentle smile. "Everything is fine," I told him quietly. I stood up, took his small hand in mine, and led him toward the main exit. I could feel the panicked stares of David and Laura burning into my back from the lounge window. They knew I had left the unsigned document on the table, but they had no idea that the document was the least of their problems. It was a ticking time bomb, and I had just started the countdown. The heavy doors clicked shut. To understand how a 21-year-old student ended up in a standoff against a prestigious university department and her own family, you have to rewind exactly 14 months. I was a junior at a top-tier university in Boston, pursuing a dual degree in computer science and quantitative finance, while other students spent their weekends at fraternity parties or football games. I lived in the basement server rooms of the research library. I preferred the steady, rhythmic hum of cooling fans over the unpredictable noise of human interactions. I was completely independent. I paid my own rent, bought my own groceries, and funded my own research. My financial independence was anchored by a single lifeline, an irrevocable educational trust fund left to me by my late grandmother. Eleanor. Eleanor was the only person in my family who recognized my analytical mind as a gift, rather than a defect. Before she passed away, she placed $250,000 in a locked trust. It was strictly designated for my tuition and academic research. She made sure David and Laura could not touch the principal. It was my shield against the chaotic financial disasters that constantly plagued my parents. Secure in my funding, I spent my nights building a specialized algorithm. It was a fraud detection model designed to identify micro-anomalies in credit transactions. Most banking systems look for massive, obvious thefts. My algorithm looked for the invisible patterns: small, repetitive drains disguised as legitimate expenses. It was built to catch the exact type of financial predators who operate in the shadows, slicing away wealth one subtle transaction at a time. I poured thousands of hours into the code. It was elegant, precise, and entirely mine. I documented every line, every failure, and every breakthrough. I was not building it for fame or a shiny crystal trophy. I was building it because I believed that mathematics offered a pure, uncorrupted version of justice. Numbers, unlike people, do not lie. They do not manipulate. They do not play favorites. And they do not ask you to sacrifice yourself for the sake of harmony. By the spring of my junior year, the model was nearly complete. My academic advisor, Marlene, recognized its potential immediately. She told me it was a revolutionary piece of work. She offered to mentor me, promising to help me secure patents and top-tier industry placements. I thought I had found a champion. I thought I was finally in a sanctuary where my intellect would be protected. I did not realize that the academic world could be just as predatory as the family I had left behind. I trusted the numbers completely. It happened at 2:15 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was sitting alone in the university's advanced computing lab, surrounded by empty coffee cups and glowing monitors. The algorithm was in its final compilation stage. I needed a completely clean, real-world dataset to run a benchmark test. Bank simulators were too predictable, and I did not have access to live institutional data yet. So, I did the most logical thing. I logged into my own secure portal and downloaded the previous 3 years of banking statements from Eleanor's irrevocable trust. It was supposed to be a simple stress test. I expected the algorithm to scan the data, find the predictable semester tuition payments, and return a clean bill of health. I uploaded the CSV files into the terminal, hit execute, and leaned back in my chair. The progress bar loaded smoothly. 1%, 50%, 99%. 3 seconds later, the primary monitor blinked a harsh, glaring red. The system alarm chimed quietly in the silent room. I sat forward, my heart rate remaining steady, assuming I had written a faulty parameter. I opened the diagnostic log to locate the bug, but there was no bug. The algorithm was operating with perfect precision. It had flagged exactly 8 anomalous withdrawals from my trust fund over the past year. Each transaction was expertly disguised under vague institutional billing codes. They were labeled as advanced research software licenses and supplementary housing fees, but my algorithm was designed to see past the labels. It followed the actual digital routing numbers. I began manually tracing the data pathways. The funds had not gone to the university housing office. They had not gone to software vendors. The money had been routed through a secondary shell account and directly paid toward a series of high-interest credit cards. I cross-referenced the dates of the withdrawals. They aligned perfectly, down to the exact day, with Ashley's luxury vacations and designer shopping sprees. I needed to see the source of the authorization. I ran a secondary script to pull the metadata and IP address attached to the digital signatures approving those transfers. The numbers cascaded down my screen in bright green text. I memorized the IP address instantly. It was not a bank. It was not a university office. The IP address mapped exactly to the commercial internet modem sitting on the television stand in David and Laura's living room. My parents were stealing my education fund. They were systematically draining Eleanor's legacy to finance my sister's manufactured lifestyle. I sat perfectly still in the quiet hum of the lab. I did not panic. I simply saved the logs, encrypted the file, and backed it up to a secure offline drive. The betrayal was absolute, but the evidence was beautiful. The screen blinked red again. Why didn't I see it coming to answer that? You have to understand the psychology of the capable child. In my family, excellence was not celebrated, it was harvested. From a very young age, I was conditioned to believe that my intelligence was a communal resource, and that my boundaries were simply obstacles to the family's comfort. This is the invisible chain of learned helplessness. You do not fight back, because fighting back makes you the villain in a script they have been writing since you were born. I remember being 12 years old and winning a state-level mathematics competition. The prize was $500. I had planned to buy a real microscope before I even held the check. Laura sat me down at the kitchen table. She spoke in that soft, reasonable tone she perfected. "Serena," she said, "Ashley's car needs new brakes so she can get to her internship. You are so smart, sweetheart. You will always have another chance to win money. Ashley needs this right now." I handed over the check. That was the first lesson my achievements were only valuable if they could be converted into Ashley's salvation. It happened again when I was 15, and again when I was 17. The chorus never changed. You will always have another chance. You are the strong one. It became a normalized pattern of extortion, dressed up as familial loyalty. I learned to stop sharing my successes. I learned to keep my bank accounts secret, my grades hidden, and my ambitions locked away. I became an island, convincing myself that distance was the same thing as safety. But distance does not protect you from people who feel entitled to your life. When I turned 18, Just a few weeks before leaving for college, Laura approached me in the kitchen. She looked stressed, holding a stack of disorganized manila folders. She handed me a blank university financial aid form. "I need you to sign the bottom of this," she said quickly. "The scholarship office needs a physical signature for an emergency housing waiver, and the courier is waiting outside." I hesitated. I hated signing things I had not read. David walked in, sighed heavily, and looked at me with deep disappointment. "Are we really going to do this today?" "Serena, your mother has been on the phone for 3 hours trying to secure your housing. Just sign the paper. It is exhausting how difficult you make everything." I looked at the blank paper. I looked at their tired, expectant faces. The guilt, programmed into my nervous system over 18 years, flared up exactly as they intended. I convinced myself it was just a housing form. I convinced myself they were my parents. And parents do not forge documents to destroy their children. I took the pen from the counter. I signed the blank paper. My grandmother, Eleanor, was not a warm woman. She did not bake cookies or knit sweaters. She was a retired actuary who viewed the world through the lens of risk and probability. She watched David and Laura cycle through debt, refinancing, and failed business ventures for decades. She saw them shield Ashley from every consequence of her extravagant spending. Most importantly, Eleanor saw exactly who I was being conditioned to become a highly competent safety net for a deeply irresponsible family. On the morning of my 18th birthday, just weeks before I left for university, Eleanor asked me to visit her. She was sitting in her study, looking frail but entirely sharp. She slid a small, heavy brass key across the desk. It belonged to a safe deposit box in downtown Boston. Then, she handed me a thick legal binder. It was the documentation for an irrevocable educational trust. She had placed $250,000 into it. Eleanor looked me dead in the eyes and delivered a warning I did not fully understand until years later. She told me that the money was locked. David and Laura could not use it as collateral. They could not borrow against it. But more importantly, she warned me about my own conditioning. "Do not ever let your gratitude become a blank signature. Serena," she said, "they will ask you for a favor, and they will call it family loyalty. Do not give it to them." She appointed an independent corporate trustee to oversee the disbursements. But Eleanor was brilliant. She knew that desperate people find creative ways to bypass human oversight. So, she embedded an automatic federal audit clause into the trust's charter. If any withdrawal exceeded a specific threshold without direct, notarized verification from me, the system would automatically flag the transaction to financial regulators. I thought the blank housing form I signed for Laura was just a bureaucratic shortcut. I was naive. David and Laura used that blank signature to forge a comprehensive power of attorney. They presented it to the trustee, claiming I was incapacitated and needed them to manage my research grants. They thought they had found a loophole. They thought they had successfully bypassed Eleanor's fortress. They did not realize that Eleanor had anticipated their exact maneuver. The trap was already set. My breaking point did not happen in a laboratory or a bank. It happened at a kitchen table. During the Thanksgiving break of my sophomore year, I reluctantly traveled home. I did not go for David or Laura. I went for Noah. My little brother was 8 years old, a quiet kid who spent most of his time drawing in his notebooks to ignore the constant arguments about credit card bills echoing through the house. I walked into the kitchen and found Noah sitting at the island, clutching a black pen. He was gripping it so tightly his small knuckles were white. He had a stack of lined paper in front of him, filled with repetitive, jagged, cursive writing. I sat down next to him and asked what he was working on so intensely. He looked up, beaming with innocent pride. "Mom is teaching me my adult signature," he said. She says I am going to help the family when I get bigger. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. I pulled the paper closer. Noah was not just practicing his name. He was repeatedly tracing his full legal name over a faint, printed template. Laura walked into the kitchen, carrying a stack of mail. When she saw me looking at Noah's papers, she froze. She quickly snatched the sheets away, laughing a high, nervous laugh. "It is just a game, Serena," she said smoothly. "We are playing office." I knew about credit scores. I knew that David's accounts were maxed out, and Ashley's debt was spiraling. In that moment, staring at my 8-year-old brother, the reality crystallized. They were not playing a game. They were grooming Noah's social security number. They were preparing a pristine, blank credit profile to systematically exploit the moment they drained my resources. They had taken my childhood. They had taken my grandmother's money. But I was absolutely not going to let them turn my little brother into their next financial victim. I did not confront Laura. I did not yell at David. I stood up, kissed Noah on the forehead, and packed my bags 3 days early. I told them I had a research project to finish. I went back to Boston and completely changed my strategy. He was their next target. Following my discovery of the IP address draining my trust fund, I needed to secure the academic side of my life. The financial theft was devastating, but my algorithmic model was my future. On a Thursday morning, I walked into the university's Advanced Computing Center. I sat at my usual workstation and attempted to log into the central mainframe to review my latest data compilations. The screen blinked. Access denied. I typed my credentials again, assuming a server lag, invalid password, contact network administrator. I sat back and looked at the blinking cursor. I opened the university's public directory, navigating to the upcoming spring academic gala submissions. The gala was the premier event where the department showcased its top research to industry recruiters and wealthy donors. I searched for my project ID number. The project appeared immediately. The title was identical to my working draft. The core methodology described in the abstract was lifted word for word from my personal notes. But the author's name had been changed. It did not say Serena. It proudly displayed the name Ashley, followed by her fabricated master's credentials. The principal investigator and faculty sponsor listed directly beneath her name was Marlene. Ashley could not write a simple Python loop if her life depended on it. She did not understand the difference between a linear regression and a neural network. Yet, there she was, registered to present a highly complex machine learning algorithm to a room full of quantitative finance experts. They had not just stolen my grandmother's money, they had systematically conspired to steal my intellect, packaging my thousands of hours of labor into a shiny resume booster for my sister. I stared at the public registry. Most people would have stormed into the administrative office. Most people would have demanded immediate justice, crying about the unfairness of the academic system. I did none of those things. I knew that screaming without impenetrable proof simply makes you look like a disgruntled, jealous student. I needed to know exactly how the code had been transferred from my secure environment to Ashley's hands. I closed the public directory. The university servers were encrypted. I never shared my central repository with Ashley, and David certainly lacked the technical literacy to bypass a firewall. There was only one person who had authorization to view my raw architecture. His name was Jacob. He was a senior graduate student, my designated research assistant, and for 4 brief months, my boyfriend. We had separated amicably, or so I had foolishly believed. I found Jacob sitting in the Student Union Cafe, typing frantically on his laptop. I bought a black coffee, walked over, and sat directly across from him. He jumped slightly, snapping his laptop shut. I did not raise my voice. I asked him a very simple question about the migration protocol for the algorithm. He could not maintain eye contact. He stared at his cold latte and mumbled a disjointed excuse about administrative server updates and restricted access levels. I did not press him. I let him sit in his own guilt, finished my coffee, and walked back to my apartment. I pulled a heavy, dust-covered laptop from under my bed. It was the offline machine I used during the early stages of development, the one Jacob and I had utilized when we worked side by side. I booted it up, bypassed the standard interface, and ran a terminal command to fetch the local Git logs. The digital footprint unrolled across my screen, telling a perfect, undeniable story. The local metadata showed that exactly 3 weeks ago, Jacob had cloned the entire repository. He had transferred the files to a secure external drop folder. Immediately after the transfer, he had executed a hard delete protocol, wiping my author commits from the university's main server. He had packaged my architecture and handed it to Ashley. He genuinely believed that purging the main server history meant erasing the crime entirely. He thought like a thief, but he did not think like an auditor. He forgot that local caches retain the ghost of every keystroke. He forgot that the machine learning model itself carried my specific encryption signature in its foundational code. He left his digital fingerprints. I scheduled a formal meeting with Marlene for the following afternoon. Her office on the 4th floor smelled of expensive espresso, old paper, and unchecked authority. She sat behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of grant proposals. I sat in the leather chair opposite her and stated the facts. I told her my name had been purged from the system. I told her Ashley did not write the algorithm. Marlene did not feign ignorance. She did not act shocked. She set her pen down, folded her hands together, and looked at me with cold, calculating precision. "Serena," she said smoothly, "the academic world is highly collaborative. Your father, David, has just finalized a very generous financial pledge to fund the department's new library wing. Ashley needs a prestigious publication to secure a corporate placement. You are young, brilliant, and you will have countless other opportunities to shine." She leaned forward, dropping the polite mentor facade. "Be a supportive sister. Serena, let this go. Do not make a mess in my department, or I will personally ensure that your dissertation defense fails. I will see to it that your academic career ends before it even begins." She thought her institutional authority was absolute. She was utilizing my stolen intellectual property to secure her upcoming promotion to dean, effectively trading my future for David's promised donor money. She believed that threatening a 21-year-old student would guarantee my silence. She expected me to shrink into the leather chair, apologize for my insubordination, and accept my role as the sacrificial lamb. I looked at the heavy gold plaques and framed degrees hanging on her wall. I thought about Yvonne, the administrative clerk Marlene treated like invisible furniture. I thought about the other international students who had likely sat in this exact chair, receiving this exact threat. I did not argue with her. I did not activate a voice recorder on my phone. I simply nodded, stood up, and adjusted my backpack. Her degrees could not save her. I did not shed a single tear as I left Marlene's office. Crying implies a loss of control, and I was entirely in control. I walked back to my apartment, locked the deadbolt, and opened my backup laptop. They had locked me out of the university's main network, believing that severing my administrative access would blind me. They fundamentally misunderstood how a quantitative analyst builds a financial system. You never build a secure infrastructure without leaving yourself a master key. I had embedded a dormant backdoor script into the core architecture of the fraud detection algorithm months ago. It was a simple, invisible tether that connected the primary code to my private, heavily encrypted cloud server. I opened my terminal, typed a 14-character command, and activated the tether. Instantly, my screen populated with a live, continuous feed of the university mainframe. I could see every keystroke, every parameter adjustment, and every clumsy attempt Ashley made to alter the code she had stolen. I watched in real time as Marlene's administrative account logged in. She was attempting to scrub the remaining developer notes, frantically deleting my margin annotations that explained the mathematical logic. They were completely unaware that my shadow script was automatically archiving every single malicious action into a secure, time-stamped ledger. They were not just stealing my intellectual property, they were actively documenting their own academic fraud in granular detail. I sat in the dim light of my apartment, drinking cold black tea, and simply let them work. Every deletion they made strengthened my eventual case. I did not intervene or attempt to lock them out. I gave them enough rope to hang themselves. But I knew that digital logs alone might be dismissed as a complex hacking attempt if David threw enough donor money at the university administration. I needed more than just code. I needed the physical institutional paper trail. I needed to see the exact forms Marlene had utilized to circumvent the university's rigorous project submission protocols. Data is a beautiful thing. It does not carry bias. It does not respond to manipulation. And it certainly does not care about David's wealth or Laura's emotional guilt trips. I spent the entire weekend organizing the raw server data into chronological spreadsheets, cross-referencing Jacob's unauthorized download with Ashley's login patterns. To acquire the physical documentation, I had to find someone within the administration who was as invisible and underappreciated as I was. I knew exactly where to look. The trap tightened silently. On Monday morning, I bypassed the main academic offices and went straight to the basement archives. The records department was a windowless, concrete room filled with metal filing cabinets. It was managed by Yvonne, a 50-year-old administrative clerk who had worked at the university for 2 decades. Marlene treated Yvonne like a piece of broken furniture, routinely dismissing her and leaving passive-aggressive notes on her desk. I had spent countless hours in the archives over the past year, cross-referencing old financial journals. I always brought Yvonne coffee. I asked about her rescue dogs. I treated her like a human being. I walked up to her desk. She looked up, pushing her reading glasses down her nose. I did not beat around the bush. I told Yvonne that my name had been removed from the upcoming academic gala registry. I told her that Marlene had authorized the change without my consent. Yvonne did not look surprised. She looked tired. She stood up, walked to a locked filing cabinet in the far corner of the room, and pulled out a thick red folder. She set it on the desk between us. Marlene thinks the digital registry is the only record that matters, Yvonne said quietly. She forgets that every system override requires a physical requisition form to be filed in this basement. Yvonne opened the folder. Inside was the original project submission form, clearly bearing my name, my signature, and the timestamp from 14 months ago. Beneath it was a recent override request, signed by Marlene, citing my sudden withdrawal from the program due to severe emotional instability. Marlene had literally forged my academic surrender. Yvonne looked at me, her eyes hardened with years of accumulated disrespect from the academic elite. I have watched Marlene systematically dismantle the careers of brilliant young women for 5 long years, Yvonne said softly. She targets the quiet ones, assuming they will not fight back. Yvonne slid a secondary log sheet across the desk. It was a printed access record showing exactly when Marlene had accessed the portal to alter the author attributions. The timestamps perfectly matched the data from my shadow script. Take the folder. Serena, Yvonne instructed, her voice completely steady. Scan everything. Build your case. Make sure that woman never sits in a position of power again. I carefully placed the red folder into my backpack. I thanked Yvonne, assuring her that her identity would remain entirely shielded from the fallout. I walked outside alone. The academic theft was now a documented reality, supported by both digital and physical evidence. However, the stolen algorithm was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. I still needed to secure my financial survival. I had to understand exactly how David and Laura managed to extract money from a trust explicitly designed to be impenetrable. The corporate trust office was located in the financial district of Boston. I secured a meeting with Mr. Harrison, the senior fiduciary officer assigned to manage Eleanor's irrevocable trust. He was a meticulous man who operated strictly by the book. When I sat down in his glass-walled office, I requested a comprehensive audit of the trust's disbursement ledger for the past 6 months. Mr. Harrison looked momentarily confused, adjusting his silk tie. He pulled up my file on his monitor and turned the screen toward me. According to our records, Serena, the trust was fully liquidated last Thursday. He stated calmly. The funds were transferred to a consolidated management account, per the instructions of your designated power of attorney. I stared at the screen. $250,000. The entire principal, painstakingly saved by Eleanor to guarantee my independence, was gone. I kept my breathing even. I did not display the shock that was currently freezing my blood. Emotional reactions yield zero strategic advantage. I asked him to produce the power of attorney document that authorized the transfer. He printed a high-resolution copy and slid it across the desk. I looked at the bottom of the page. There it was. My own signature, written in blue ink. It was the exact signature I had placed on the blank housing waiver Laura had shoved in front of me when I was 18. David and Laura had taken that blank signature, printed a comprehensive financial mandate above it, and officially stripped me of my financial autonomy. But as I read the forged document, a cold, sharp realization settled over me. In their greed, they had made a fatal, arrogant error. An irrevocable trust cannot be liquidated by a general power of attorney without a secondary verification of medical incapacitation. The document David submitted contained a forged medical addendum, claiming I was suffering from severe psychiatric distress. I pointed to the medical seal on the second page. Mr. Harrison, I said, maintaining a perfectly level, clinical tone. I am sitting in front of you, fully lucid. This medical certification is entirely fraudulent. Furthermore, the notary stamp on this document belongs to an agent whose state license expired 3 years ago. Check the registry. Mr. Harrison's professional demeanor instantly vanished. If a federal bank processes a fraudulent wire transfer from a protected trust, the institution becomes entirely liable for the full amount. I simply requested an internal fraud investigation. The bank was now liable. 2 days later, David and Laura arrived in Boston unannounced. They did not come to apologize for draining my trust fund. They came because the bank had executed a hard freeze on their destination account, effectively locking them out of the stolen money pending the federal investigation. They intercepted me outside my apartment building, looking frantic and deeply angry. I unlocked my door and allowed them inside, offering them a seat at my small dining table. I wanted to hear exactly how they planned to justify grand larceny. David did not waste time. He pulled a printed Excel spreadsheet from his leather briefcase and slapped it onto the table. Serena, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The bank is asking ridiculous questions. You need to call them immediately and verify the transfer. I looked at the spreadsheet. It was titled Cumulative Maintenance Expenses. I scanned the rows. David had meticulously calculated the cost of my food, clothing, and basic medical care from the time I was 5 years old. He had added an arbitrary compounding interest rate to the total. The final sum at the bottom of the page was conveniently listed as exactly $250,000. "We are not stealing from you," Laura said, utilizing her soft, manipulative tone. "We are simply recouping our investment. You owe us this money for raising you. Ashley needs to pay off her creditors, and it is only fair that you contribute your share to this family. You are being incredibly selfish by freezing that account." I stared at the spreadsheet. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic delusion. They had literally sent me an invoice for my own childhood. But as I looked closer at the itemized expenses, the delusion shattered into blatant absurdity. The spreadsheet included line items for a luxury vacation to the Bahamas that I had not attended, expensive cosmetic procedures billed to a clinic Laura frequented, and country club membership fees. They were not recouping the cost of raising me. They were retroactively billing me for their own extravagant failures. I did not express anger. I did not point out the fraudulent line items. I simply slid the spreadsheet back across the table. "I cannot authorize the release of those funds, David," I said evenly. "The bank has classified the transaction as wire fraud. It is out of my hands." David's face flushed with genuine rage. He stood up, towering over the small table in an attempt to physically intimidate me. "You will call them, Serena," he demanded, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You will call the bank right now, or you will no longer be a part of this family." I observed them the way a scientist observes a predictable chemical reaction. I did not call them. After David and Laura stormed out, I noticed Laura had left her designer handbag unzipped on my entryway console. A stack of crumpled mail had spilled out onto the hardwood floor. I knelt down to gather the envelopes, intending to leave them in a neat pile for her eventual return. As I picked up the stack, a stark red logo caught my eye. It was a final collection notice from a prominent high-yield credit agency. I paused, reading the name printed in the clear plastic window. The letter was not addressed to David. It was not addressed to Laura, and it was not addressed to Ashley. The collection notice was explicitly addressed to Noah. My 8-year-old brother already had a delinquent credit account functioning in his name. I carefully opened the envelope, sliding the statement out. The details were entirely sickening. A premium travel credit card had been opened using Noah's social security number and an altered date of birth. The account was maxed out at $24,000, entirely spent on luxury goods and international flights that perfectly mirrored Ashley's recent social media posts. They had officially weaponized a child's identity to fund a fake academic lifestyle. If you have ever discovered a dark financial secret hidden by the people you trusted most, tell me you are here in the comments. You do not have to explain. Just let me know I am not alone. The anger I felt was no longer a cold, analytical observation. It was absolute, structural fury. They had crossed the final, unforgivable boundary. Stealing my algorithm was an academic dispute that I could manage. Draining my trust fund was a financial betrayal that the bank was already untangling. But systematically destroying the financial future of an innocent 8-year-old boy before he even knew how to multiply fractions was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. I pulled out my phone and meticulously photographed every single page of the collection notice under the bright hallway light. I captured the account numbers, the fraudulent billing address, and the falsified birth dates. I realized in that quiet hallway that simply defending my own assets was fundamentally insufficient. Cutting ties and walking away to build my own successful career would leave Noah trapped inside a burning financial house. I could not just protect myself. I had to completely dismantle the infrastructure that allowed David, Laura, and Ashley to operate. I needed to ensure they could never apply for a loan, secure a mortgage, or open another fraudulent account under a minor's name for the rest of their natural lives. I walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and created a new, highly encrypted directory. I named the folder Noah. The war had officially begun. People who do not understand technology often believe that deletion is permanent. Jacob genuinely believed that by erasing my author commits from the university's primary server, he had effectively erased my ownership of the algorithm. He fundamentally misunderstood how digital infrastructure operates. He deleted the visible code, but he completely ignored the metadata. Metadata is simply the data about the data. It is the invisible, indestructible ledger that records exactly who created a file, what machine they used, and the precise millisecond the creation occurred. When I accessed my encrypted cloud backup, I did not just have my original code. I had the complete server logs provided by the independent hosting company. Those logs showed that my unique cryptographic key had compiled the foundational neural network 14 months prior. The logs also showed Jacob logging in with his specific student credentials, downloading the architecture, and subsequently transferring it to an IP address associated with Ashley's laptop. He left a digital trail as clear as muddy footprints on a white carpet. The financial theft committed by David and Laura operated on the exact same arrogance. They believed that forging a signature on a general power of attorney was a masterstroke of deception. They did not understand the structural anatomy of an irrevocable trust. My grandmother Eleanor had not deposited $250,000 into a standard savings account. She had locked it inside a legal fortress. A general power of attorney does not grant someone the authority to dissolve an irrevocable trust. To execute that transfer, David and Laura had submitted a fraudulent medical addendum claiming I was mentally incapacitated. However, federal banking regulations mandate that corporate trustees verify severe medical claims through an independent medical board. When the bank's compliance software scanned the physician's license number on their forged document, it returned an error. The doctor they had invented did not exist. The system automatically triggered a suspicious activity report, sending the file directly to federal investigators. They thought they were outsmarting a 21-year-old student. In reality, they had triggered an automated federal wire fraud investigation. I did not have to hack the bank. I did not have to manipulate the code. I simply had to gather the organic, unfiltered data that their own sloppy crimes had generated. I organized the IP logs, the time-stamped server records, and the bank's automated compliance alerts into a beautifully structured spreadsheet. I examined the undeniable proof of their impending destruction. The metadata never lies. The digital evidence against Jacob and my family was impenetrable, but Marlene's involvement required a different type of analysis. She was a senior academic advisor. She understood how to hide behind institutional bureaucracy. If I only proved that Ashley had stolen the algorithm, Marlene would simply claim she had been deceived by a dishonest student. She would feign shock, issue a public apology, and gracefully step into the dean's office with her reputation completely intact. I needed to prove that Marlene was the architect of the theft. I spent Tuesday evening meticulously reviewing the physical access records Yvonne had given me from the basement archives. I began to cross-reference Marlene's override authorizations with the university's historical graduation data. A dark, systemic pattern rapidly emerged from the numbers. Over the past 5 years, Marlene had utilized the exact same administrative override code to alter the primary authorship on 7 different research projects. Every single time. The original author was either an international student dependent on a visa, a low-income scholar desperate for recommendations, or a student she had falsely documented as emotionally unstable. And every single time, The new author inserted into the project was a wealthy, well-connected student whose parents were major university donors. Marlene was not just an unethical advisor. She was running a highly sophisticated, localized extortion ring. She was harvesting the intellectual property of vulnerable students and selling it to the highest bidder to secure her own professional advancement. She had built her entire career by acting as a broker for stolen academic brilliance. When David pledged a massive financial donation to the new library wing, Marlene saw an opportunity. She identified my algorithm, removed my name, and handed it to Ashley as a transactional favor. She knew David would ensure her promotion to dean if his favorite daughter graduated with honors. She assumed I would be just another silent, compliant victim in her long history of academic exploitation. I arranged the 7 physical override forms on my dining table. Each form represented a stolen future. Each form bore Marlene's distinct, looping signature. I scanned every document into my encrypted drive, creating a secondary portfolio focused entirely on her administrative corruption. I was no longer just fighting for my own algorithm. I was dismantling an entire ecosystem of academic abuse. The pattern was perfectly clear. I could not walk into a confrontation armed only with spreadsheets and raw data. I needed professional, lethal articulation. On Wednesday morning, I withdrew the last $5,000 from the emergency cash reserve Eleanor had hidden in the safe deposit box. I walked into the downtown office of a highly aggressive, deeply respected intellectual property attorney. I sat in his boardroom and laid out the server logs, the forged medical documents, and the 7 academic override forms. He listened in complete silence for 40 minutes. When I finished, he did not offer sympathy. He offered a strategy. We spent the next 48 hours packaging the raw data into 3 distinct, legally binding dossiers. The first dossier was a formal intellectual property injunction, destined for the university's Academic Integrity Board. The second dossier was a comprehensive financial fraud summary, formatted specifically for the federal investigators already looking into David and Laura's bank transfer. The third dossier was the most important. It was a petition for emergency protective custody. It detailed the fraudulent credit account opened under Noah's Social Security number, backed by the physical collection notices and the IP logs tracing the transactions to our parents' home. It was designed for a family court judge, proving that David and Laura represented an immediate, catastrophic threat to an 8-year-old child's future. My attorney drafted a formal cease and desist letter, attaching it to the academic dossier. We printed 6 identical copies of the evidence and placed them into heavy, black leather binders. I ran my hand over the smooth covers. There was no anger left in my body. There was only a profound sense of operational readiness. I knew exactly what I was going to do. We were exactly 9 days away from the academic gala. If you are ready to see what happens when the scapegoat finally brings the receipts, hit subscribe. I placed the black binders carefully into my leather briefcase. I did not text my parents. I did not answer Jacob's nervous emails. I simply went to class, drank my black coffee, and waited for Friday evening. I knew they would attempt to force my compliance before Ashley stepped onto the stage to accept the award. They needed my signature to legitimize their theft. They needed me to surrender. The trap was fully set. It was 7:30 on a Friday evening. We were standing in the VIP lounge of the university's spring academic gala. The heavy oak doors were shut, isolating us from the muffled jazz music and the clinking of champagne glasses in the main hall. The scent of expensive perfume and nervous sweat filled the small room. David, Laura, Ashley, and Marlene had just pushed the backdated non-disclosure agreement across the mahogany table. This brings us back to the moment I refused to sign. The moment the grandfather clock ticked past 7:34. The door to the VIP lounge suddenly opened. The dean of the business school walked in, wearing a sharp tuxedo and a practiced, diplomatic smile. He had been waiting in the corridor, serving as their ultimate weapon of institutional pressure. "Serena," he said smoothly, taking a seat at the head of the table. "I understand you are feeling overlooked. Research disputes are common, but we must protect the integrity of the institution. We are prepared to offer you a highly generous compromise." Marlene nodded eagerly. The dean outlined the terms. "If I signed the NDA and allowed Ashley to accept the award, the university would officially list me as a secondary co-author on the final publication." David immediately chimed in, utilizing his best paternal tone. "And your mother and I will personally pay off your student housing loans. Serena, we will ensure you are comfortable. We are offering you a guaranteed future. Let your sister have her moment." They were offering to buy my silence using the very funds they had stolen from my grandmother's trust. They were offering me a secondary credit on an algorithm I had built from scratch. They looked at me with expectant, arrogant smiles. They truly believed that a 21-year-old student would crumble under the combined weight of parental guilt and institutional authority. They thought the illusion of power was equivalent to actual leverage. I looked at the dean. He had no idea about the wire fraud. He had no idea about Marlene's 7 forged override forms. He was simply trying to secure David's promised library donation by silencing a troublesome undergraduate. I did not raise my voice. I did not display any outrage. I simply placed my leather briefcase onto the mahogany table. The heavy brass clasps clicked loudly in the silent room. I opened the first folder. I pulled the first black binder from my briefcase and slid it directly across the table to the dean. I did not hand anything to my parents or Marlene. "Dean Reynolds," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. "Before we discuss co-authorship, I think it is important that the primary author demonstrates a fundamental understanding of the work being presented tonight." I turned my gaze to my sister. Ashley was clutching the crystal trophy, her face pale beneath her heavy makeup. "Ashley," I said calmly, "the predictive model utilizes a backpropagation technique to minimize error margins in the credit data. Could you please explain to the dean how the algorithm handles the vanishing gradient problem within the hidden layers?" The room instantly froze. The technical terminology hung in the air like a physical weight. Ashley opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Marlene in sheer panic. She looked at David. She stammered, attempting to string together buzzwords she had memorized from my abstract. "It uses the data," she whispered defensively. "It processes the credit limits to find the gradient." She did not even know what a gradient was. The dean frowned. Looking between Ashley and me, I did not let the silence linger. I instructed the dean to open the binder to page 4. Page 4 is a certified server log from the independent cloud hosting provider. I explained methodically. It contains the cryptographic hash, confirming that I compiled the foundational architecture 14 months ago. Page 5 is the original, physical project submission form, bearing the official university stamp, before Marlene utilized administrative override code 724 to illegally remove my name. Marlene's face lost all its color. She stood up abruptly. "Dean Reynolds, this is fabricated nonsense," she stammered, her voice suddenly shrill. "She is a disgruntled student trying to sabotage her sister. This is a family dispute, not an academic matter." I did not look at Marlene. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the dean. Page 8. I continued relentlessly. "Is a comprehensive list of 7 other international and low-income students whose primary authorship was overridden by Marlene, using that exact same administrative code over the past 5 years. She is not an advisor. She is operating an academic extortion ring within your department. The dean stared at the documents. He looked at the server logs, the timestamps, and the undeniable physical evidence of systematic corruption. The diplomatic smile completely vanished from his face. He realized instantly that covering this up was no longer an option. The liability was catastrophic. The room went completely silent. The silence in the VIP lounge was incredibly fragile. Dean Reynolds stared at the undeniable proof of Marlene's academic extortion. The power dynamic in the room had shifted violently in less than 3 minutes. Ashley, sensing the collapse of her carefully constructed narrative, decided to deploy a desperate tactic. I watched her slide her phone slightly forward on the mahogany table. The screen was dark, but the subtle red indicator light of a recording application was visible. She wanted to bait me. She needed an audio clip of me screaming, sounding unhinged and jealous, so she could post it online and salvage her reputation as a victim. I did not take the bait. I did not ask her to turn off the device. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and utilized her recording app to my absolute advantage. "Ashley," I said, keeping my voice soft and perfectly modulated. "Are you stating for the record that you believe you are entitled to the algorithm because I am capable of simply coding a new one?" Ashley sneered, completely missing the trap. "Yes," she snapped. "You have always been selfish. You owe this family for raising you. We just borrowed your code." I shifted my gaze to Laura. "And the credit card you opened in Noah's name," I asked evenly. "Is an 8-year-old boy also expected to pay for Ashley's lifestyle?" Laura waved her hand dismissively. "Noah is just a backup plan until your father's investments pay off," she answered, completely unaware she was recording a confession to identity theft. David slammed his fist on the table. "We only borrowed your signature for the trust fund." "Serena," he barked loudly. "The money is staying in the family." Marlene, trying to regain control of the room, added her own fatal admission. "I removed your name for the greater good of the department." "Serena, your father's donation was essential." I sat perfectly still. In less than 60 seconds, they had voluntarily confessed to academic fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny, all perfectly captured in high-definition audio on Ashley's own device. They were so blinded by their own entitlement that they forgot to filter their words. I looked at Ashley's phone, then looked directly into her panicked eyes. I smiled. A small, clinical gesture. "Be sure to save that file." "Ashley," I instructed calmly. "The federal investigators will definitely need a clean copy for their records." The blood drained from her face as she looked down at the recording light. She reached out to delete the file, her hands trembling violently, but the damage was already permanently done. I had already activated a background Bluetooth capture protocol from my own device. The confession was secured. David realized the academic narrative was completely lost. He tried to pivot, attempting to use his financial weight to crush the situation before it escalated further. He looked at Dean Reynolds, utilizing his deepest, most authoritative voice. "Dean, this is a private family matter that has gotten out of hand," David said, adjusting his expensive tie. "My daughter is clearly unwell. We will handle her. Now, regarding the $2 million pledge for the new library wing, I believe we can finalize the paperwork by Monday morning." He was overtly attempting to buy the dean's silence in front of me. He truly believed his checkbook was a universal shield against consequences. I did not interrupt him. I waited for him to finish his sentence. Then, I opened the second black binder on the table and slid it precisely to the center. "David," I said quietly, "you cannot fund a library wing when your assets are currently locked by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." David froze. The dean looked at the new binder. I opened it to the first tab. This is a suspicious activity report generated by the corporate trustee of Eleanor's irrevocable trust. I explained to the room. It documents exactly how David and Laura utilized a forged medical addendum and a fraudulent power of attorney to execute a wire transfer of $250,000 across state lines. In the United States, that is classified as federal wire fraud. I turn the page, revealing the automated banking alerts and the IP logs, tracking the transfer directly to their home network. Because the transaction crossed federal banking jurisdictions, the bank's compliance software automatically escalated the file to federal authorities. The destination account was frozen at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. They do not have $2 million to donate to this university. They do not even have access to their grocery money. Dean Reynolds physically pushed his chair away from David, as if proximity to him might be a legally contagious disease. The university could survive a minor plagiarism scandal, but accepting a massive donation from individuals under active federal investigation for wire fraud was institutional suicide. David's authoritative posture collapsed. He looked at the federal banking documents, his mouth opening and closing silently. Laura began to hyperventilate, clutching her designer handbag. They had built an entire empire of superiority entirely funded by stolen money and empty promises. I watched their absolute structural collapse with zero pity. They were completely broke. With the lawyer gone, the final illusion of control evaporated. Dean Reynolds stood up rapidly, desperate to contain the massive liability radiating from his department. "Serena," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we can fix this immediately. I will personally revoke Ashley's submission. I will have the trophy re-engraved with your name. You can walk out onto that stage right now, accept the award, and we can keep this entire federal investigation quiet. We will give you a full doctoral fellowship." He was offering me the exact academic glory I had worked 14 months to achieve. He was offering me the spotlight, the validation, and a guaranteed career trajectory. All I had to do was ignore the systemic corruption and let my family walk away with a quiet warning. I looked at the crystal trophy sitting on the table. It looked incredibly small and insignificant. I thought about Noah, standing out in the lobby with his frayed backpack, waiting for parents who were actively planning to destroy his credit score before he reached middle school. I realized that accepting a compromised award from a corrupt institution would simply make me a participant in their toxic ecosystem. "I do not want your fellowship, Dean Reynolds," I replied smoothly, "and I do not want an award that requires my silence." I closed my briefcase and engaged the brass locks. "I am not attending the ceremony tonight. I have a much more important appointment in the morning." The next day, while the university was scrambling to manage the fallout of the canceled gala, I walked up the marble steps of the Boston Family Court. I wore a sharp gray suit. I carried the third black binder. I walked into the emergency hearing room and presented the judge with the irrefutable evidence: the forged power of attorney, the frozen bank accounts, and the final collection notices for the credit cards opened under an 8-year-old boy's social security number. I did not ask the judge for revenge. I asked for emergency protective custody of my little brother. I presented my clean financial records, my secured apartment lease, and my pristine background check. The judge reviewed the staggering evidence of parental financial abuse. He looked at me, then signed the emergency order without a moment of hesitation. I walked out with Noah. 6 weeks passed. The fallout from the gala was clinical, precise, and absolutely devastating. I did not have to lift a finger to orchestrate their ruin. The systems I had activated simply ran their natural course. The university's Academic Integrity Board launched a full investigation based on the physical files Yvonne had secured. Marlene was stripped of her tenure, fired immediately, and publicly disgraced. Jacob was quietly expelled, his academic career permanently erased from the university registry. Ashley was formally stripped of her master's degree credentials for submitting stolen intellectual property. Without her academic status, the corporate firm that had offered her a prestigious placement rescinded their contract. She was left entirely unemployable in the financial sector. But the hardest blow landed on David and Laura. The federal investigation into the wire fraud escalated rapidly. The FBI formally seized all of their liquid assets. Their country club memberships were revoked. Their luxury vehicles, leased under fraudulent terms, were repossessed from their driveway in broad daylight. They were facing multiple counts of identity theft and bank fraud. On a Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. It was Laura. Serena. The message read, "Please. We cannot pay the mortgage. We are going to lose the house. We are family. You have to help us post bail. I am begging you." I stared at the screen. I felt no triumph, but I also felt no pity. They were finally experiencing the exact vulnerability they had forced upon me and Noah for years. They expected me to fall back into my designated role as the family savior. They expected the invisible chain of learned helplessness to pull me back to their sinking ship. I did not reply to the message. Instead, I forwarded the text to my attorney. Within 24 hours, a judge granted a permanent restraining order, legally barring David, Laura, and Ashley from contacting me or Noah ever again. I blocked the number and deleted the conversation thread. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy, but it was fundamentally clean. The architecture of their manipulation had been entirely dismantled, reduced to a pile of unpaid bills and federal indictments. I turned off my phone. 4 months after I walked out of the family court building, I unlocked the front door to a spacious, sunlit apartment in a historic Boston brownstone. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of my past was entirely gone. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of fresh black coffee. I did not have to hide my achievements anymore. I did not have to look over my shoulder, wondering who was actively planning to steal my resources. I leaned against the marble counter and looked into the living room. Noah was sitting at a heavy oak dining table. He was 8 years old, but for the first time in his life, he actually looked like a child. He was not clutching a pen, nervously practicing an adult signature to facilitate a felony. He was working on his third-grade fractions, chewing on the end of a yellow pencil. The terrifying collection notices that once carried his name had been entirely eradicated by the federal investigators. His credit profile was locked, secured, and pristine. He was finally safe. I did not lose my academic trajectory when I walked away from that gala. In fact, the absolute destruction of Marlene's extortion ring made me highly visible to the exact people who truly mattered. Several independent institutional investors had followed the federal wire fraud case. They did not care about university politics. They cared about raw, undeniable analytical talent. With their backing, I officially patented my predictive algorithm as an independent software enterprise. I took the exact mathematical model that David, Laura, and Ashley had tried to steal, and I weaponized it for good. I launched a tech initiative specifically designed to audit academic funding and protect the intellectual property of vulnerable scholars. Universities across the country, terrified of facing a massive public relations disaster like the one that destroyed Marlene, began purchasing my software to monitor their own internal departments. I used the revenue from those corporate contracts to establish a pro bono legal network. We provided free, aggressive representation for international and low-income students who were facing academic theft by their superiors. I became the exact shield that I had desperately needed when I was an undergraduate. I did not just survive the fire they set to burn me. I used the heat to forge an absolute fortress. I watched Noah flip his notebook to a new page, humming a quiet tune to himself. The future was entirely ours. When you are raised in an environment that treats your capability as a communal asset, walking away feels like a profound betrayal. Society conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable, sacred bond. We are taught that blood requires infinite forgiveness. But sometimes, the people who share your DNA are simply predators who happen to have a key to your front door. They will label your boundaries as selfishness. They will call your logical self-defense an act of cruelty. For 21 years, I allowed David and Laura to define my worth based entirely on what I could provide for Ashley. I allowed them to convince me that I was a difficult, cold daughter, simply because I wanted to retain the basic rights to my own intellect and my grandmother's legacy. I accepted their narrative because it was easier than facing the terrifying reality that my parents viewed me as a financial utility rather than a human being. When you finally stop signing the blank papers they place in front of you, the resulting explosion is never your fault. The collapse of my family was not caused by my refusal to share a crystal academic trophy. It was caused by their arrogant assumption that they could commit wire fraud, steal a child's identity, and manipulate an academic institution without ever facing a single consequence. I simply provided the documentation that exposed their long history of theft. If you are the designated workhorse in your family, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe your future to people who refuse to build their own. Lacking boundaries is not a virtue, and enduring financial abuse is not a badge of honor. Loyalty does not mean allowing someone to burn your future just to keep themselves warm. You are allowed to take your intellect, your resources, and your peace. And you are allowed to quietly walk out the door. I built a beautiful life for myself and my brother because I finally accepted that being the villain in their story was the only way to become the hero in my own. I never looked back. If you are out there bleeding yourself dry to keep a toxic family afloat, stop. Protect your peace. Protect your future. Share this with someone who needs the courage to walk away. And take care of yourself.